and why we have laid it out, basically to understand what it is that we found in new evidence that we have been able to churn out. And then how can that set forth a pathway towards taking critical steps at the level of the G20, at national level, and in different ways as we can, so that we're able to tackle this crisis head on, and at the same time make sure that our brothers, our sisters, friends, families who are faced with this crisis on a daily basis are able to weather the storm. On that note, I would like to zoom straight into the agenda that we have laid for the day, if you'll allow me. Like I said, we've lost a bit of time because of the little bit of the hitches that we had at the start. And so I would say at this point, we are basically just quick pointers of welcome. And from that, what I want to do is hear from some of our senior folks in Oxfam, basically to welcome you properly. I'm not sure I'm a good person to do that, because anyway, I will leave that out. And then we would also have some quick reflections to help set the tone for the sessions that we would have over the next hour and some minutes by one of our own, mathematicians, who has so willingly agreed to do that for us. Then it would take us down to the presentation of the findings. Brief. That would also be brief, so that we get a fair sense, really, of what I was talking about in terms of the scale of the issues. It will allow us to kind of interact by way of questions, and then the enormous brains, I'll put it that way, the genius minds, who would have the opportunity to help us connect the different threads together through targeted questions in the panel session, would help us with that. And then we would close the session with a summary of remarks by Dr. Latif, who will be doing that virtually. And then I'll say we call it a night. So if I may start right into the agenda, allow me to welcome to the podium Nkateko Shaw, Acting Executive Director, Oxfam, South Africa. With a round of applause, correct, sir. Is it okay?
Thank you, Francis, for that. My role here is an easy one, is to do the officiation. And so I'd firstly like to appreciate all of you who have made the time to join us here today. Our fellow activists in the room, organizations that we work and partner with, comrades who are both here and online, but also recognizing the leadership at Oxfam as well, who is also participating in this very important discussion online, and that is our board. So I extend my warm welcome to you all, and I really want to extend my sincerest gratitude to the teams that have pulled this event together. And I also want to recognize that this event itself is happening alongside a very important moment around the G20 as well. So I salute you all for the time you have taken to be here. On inequality, titled Africa's Inequality Crisis and the Rise of the Super Rich. Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear more about the findings of the report as we proceed today, but allow me to highlight a few points around the subject matter itself. At Oxfam, our very DNA is that we cannot tackle inequality and talk about justice without recognizing that that goes along with transformation. Furthermore, as a global movement of people, we also see that this crisis has to move beyond rhetoric, but to practical solutions. Now, this report highlights the precarity of inequality, but also underpins that this is an obligation that actually demands justice, but also concrete actions. While we see that our people struggle with poverty, escalating levels of inequality, rising climate crisis, the debt trap that continues to confront our economies, and the overall decline in social services, as well as the social fabric. There's an invisible hand that is at work here, and our role is to call it out. Our role is to name those who continue to flourish at the expense of others. These are the everyday realities of the communities that we serve, the communities that we work with. Yet we have conferences happening at a high political level, making decisions on our behalf. And so for Oxfam, in our work, we stand in solidarity with the bottom 99%, recognizing that the 1% concentration of wealth in the hands of the few has for far too long been at the detriment of our people. So as our ministers of finance, central bank governors meet today to discuss G20 deliberations, we are here to also make a call to action around taxing the super rich, ensuring that taxation on high net wealth individuals results into concrete resources that will help us address development challenges as we know them. I'd like to recognize as well that my heart wounds when I see that as women, as men, as comrades, as activists, we are taking full charge of ensuring that those who are deciding on our behalf know exactly that the rich must pay their fair share. So I'd like to highlight that this year, with the African Union itself as a member of the G20, we are glad to see that they've taken a positive step by declaring 2025 as a year of justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. A long-awaited conversation, and it's good to see that our heads of state on the continent are taking that conversation seriously. And so as finance ministers meet today, here in Durban, this report that we're going to talk about today highlights key recommendations bearing testimony to the plight of inequality for Africans, but also calls its leaders to take action. Now is the time to act. We cannot afford to wait any longer. Rhetoric must be translated into action, and I am hopeful that the ministers would take bold measures towards progressive taxation, as we've seen with the outcomes of the Financing for Development Conference, where we've seen a new coalition come up with the support of South Africa, Spain, and Brazil, calling for a tax on high net worth individuals. We want to ensure that the rich 1% pay more, and that we are able to achieve the African Union's 15% inequality reduction target within this decade. Comrades, colleagues, friends, I stand here in solidarity, and I'd like to thank you for your audience and for the time that we are going to share today. I also extend my sincerest gratitude for the high-level panel that we are going to hear later on today that will tell us and paint the story about the plight of inequality as we understand it, but also provide some key recommendations on what actions to take. And as Francis started us off, Amanda! Thank you.
Okay, I don't know that one. Yeah, thank you, Kateko. She's always very soft-spoken. Every time we connect, and I think that's every year, I always say that. But I picked up something that it must transcend, the rhetoric that we see day in and out. There's got to be action, and as we have, finance ministers meeting here, that is what we are asking for. Thank you very much for that. And shall we give her a round of applause for no. For colleagues who are online, I understand there are some technical challenges in relation to the audio. The team are trying to fix it, and so please bear with us. It should be better in the next few minutes so that you get to savor the crux of the discussions. I'd like that we make progress with the time that we have to the next key point on the agenda, and that is to hear from Matthew Martins, who is the Executive Director of Development Finance International. He would walk us through some key reflections, as I had said at the beginning, basically to help set the tone, weaving in the different threads as relates to this priority theme, and then we can take it forward. So Matthew, I don't know if he's ready and all set to rock and roll. Hello, Matthew. Do you want to just chime in, say something a little bit so we check how the audio is? And if you can hear me clearly. One second. You should stop.
For several years, a few years ago, and it's always a pleasure to work with an organisation that is so passionate about fighting inequality in South Africa and across the planet. I want to really focus...
Okay. Hello, Matthew. Can you hear us? We did have a little bit of a challenge, and we didn't hear your initial statements in the starting. So if you wouldn't mind to start off.
Can you hear me or not?
We can hear you now.
Matthew, I'm a virtual participant and I can hear you clearly. I think could be the people in the room who cannot hear us.
Okay. Yes,
now we can hear you.
Virtual people were having trouble hearing the people in the room, so that would make sense.
Now we can hear you.
I'm going to carry on, even though occasionally I see other people in the room doing things. Otherwise, we'll be way behind time. Okay, what I want to talk about is the broader context. Why and how G20 must tackle inequality. Because I know that after this, the Oxfam Africa team are going to be presenting what the situation is in Africa and what much more specifically needs to be done in Africa. First of all, why should the G20 care about inequality? Most of you know that the G20 is more of a kind of financial organization that was set up to confront the global financial crisis back in 2008. But first of all, we need to take into account that there's growing global anti-inequality focus since 2010. back in 2010, when I first started really working with Oxfam in Oxfam, Great Britain, there was virtually no mention of inequality in international discussions. But then there was a growing analysis and acknowledgement, with Oxfam at the forefront of that debate, that inequality had worsened dramatically since 1980, and that extreme poverty could not possibly be ended without a major fall in inequality. That culminated in 2015, the first time the world set a goal, Sustainable Development Goal 10, to reduce inequality. But it, for various reasons, political reasons, which I won't go into, was measured in a very strange way, where it just compared the income of the poorest with the average and completely kind of ignored the richest, deliberately, because some people did not want to focus on how obscenely wealthy the very wealthy were becoming. And so we had this weird indicator called shared prosperity. Unfortunately, this was very disconnected from virtually every study which had shown, using other indicators, that inequality was increasing political instability, crime, violence across the world, reducing life expectancy, and so on. All of those studies looked at what was happening, including the richest. At the same time, there's been a growing anti-inequality movement outside the conference rooms and lecture halls. Because they see the inequality every day around them, between 65% and 75%, depending on the country, of the world's citizens see inequality as an important issue and believe that the rich should pay a fairer, which means a higher, share of taxes, rather than paying less tax than poor people, as they do at the moment. And even today, outside the conference, there's a Fight Inequality Alliance protest in Durban, bringing together citizens, civil society unions, and other organizations, and they've written an open letter on behalf of 180 organizations in the Global South to President Ramaphosa. So we've seen, partly because of this pressure, even more emphasis on inequality in 2024, 2025. But this was also because there'd been virtually no progress on reducing inequality since the indicator was set in 2015. If you look at the progress reports that the UN is producing showing what's happening with SDG 10, it's among the 3 worst performing SDGs out of 16, even in a context where almost all of them are not on track, but actually inequality is one of the worst performers. So what we've seen is a renewed emphasis on accelerating progress in 2024-25. You see the UN and the World Bank moving to measuring genuine inequality, including all of the rich. And the World Bank has even now set a target to end extreme inequality with the countries with the highest inequality. And as was mentioned in the opening remarks, the African Union also introduced an anti-inequality target to reduce inequality by 15% over the next 10 years in its 10-year plan for Agenda 2063. So in that context, the G20 really must care. But there's some specific reasons why the G20 should be caring. If its core mandate is about growth and global financial stability, there's a lot of literature out there showing that inequality, which is more than 0.27 or 0.3 Gini, so pretty what some people would consider relatively low levels, still undermines growth. And we're in a time now, due to all the post-COVID polycrises and various other things, that everybody is saying we're going to have stagnant or very low growth for the next few years, around 2% in the OECD, maybe 4% if we're lucky across Africa. And what the evidence shows is that you could more than double that per capita real growth rate across the world if you reduced inequality substantially. So there's a real reason, if the G20 cares about growth, for it to focus on reducing inequality. But also that we know from history that extreme inequality is what causes financial instability. What causes financial crises is when wealthy people look for very high risk returns to make even more money and cause a financial crisis. So that's probably why, or one of the main reasons why there's been a new focus on discussing measures to tackle inequality, especially progressive taxes in the G20. But it's also because for the last couple of years, the G20 has been led by relatively progressive governments, Brazil and now South Africa. So what can we say about what's actually been done to fight inequality and what needs to be done? First of all, it's really important to say that we know that high inequality is not inevitable. Some people seem to think that it's go with us forever, but it isn't. It's a policy choice, and many countries have managed to reduce inequality sharply over the last few decades. Secondly, we know which policies reduce inequality most effectively, and that's providing free public services to people, notably education, health, housing, social protection and water, having progressive taxation where the wealthy and corporations pay their fair share of taxes, enhancing labour and union rights so that they can do genuine collective bargaining and push up their wages and their conditions, but also having well-established and high levels of minimum wages. And then there are structural policies beyond those to tackle the inequality that people have in access to different types of capital, notably land and finance. And we also know that reducing the inequality of income and wealth between the rich and poor will also tackle the other really big inequalities that are out there, the gender inequalities, the racial inequalities, though of course additional policies are also needed to overcome historical and colonial legacies of discrimination. So what can we say about whether people have been actually taking these policy measures? Well, since 2015, DFI and Oxfam have been analysing together country policies to reduce inequality, focusing on public services, progressive taxation and labour rights through what's called the Commitment to Reducing Inequality Index, or CRI. And it's become a very widely used tool by the IMF to assess whether countries are making efforts to include everybody in growth, by the Addis Tax Initiative to assess whether tax systems are progressive, by the Allianz investment people to assess whether government policies are supporting sustainable investment, and so on. And even today, we've had a launch of Malawi Inequality Report and Profile with a wide range of Malawian policymakers and civil society and religious stakeholders to talk to the Malawian government about what they can do more specifically about inequality. And that's part of a broader process of rolling out a whole set of country events across Eastern and Southern Africa over the next few months. But what can we say are the key conclusions of this decade of analysis? Well, there's a sharp divide between what was going on before COVID and after COVID. So before COVID, actually things were looking quite good. Not as good as they could have been, but not bad. So globally, for example, countries increased their share of budgets on going to public services, and Africa was leading the way on this. So they rose by 2.3% of the budget in each country on average. And that meant that access of the poor to those services rose, and inequality was reduced by about a quarter, whereas previously it was only being reduced by about a fifth, just through the impact of public services on people's incomes. Secondly, we see that tax systems, which back in 2015 were on the whole exacerbating inequality, in other words, because poorer people were paying a higher share of tax than rich people, they became pretty much neutral in their impact. And that's because countries made a big effort to increase their collection of their existing progressive income taxes. And thirdly, we saw that labour rights had improved somewhat, particularly more focus on giving equal rights to women, and minimum wages had risen as a percentage of GDP. So that resulted in a small fall in wage inequality. But then post-COVID, we've seen a big change in the situation. So first of all, growing debt service and austerity, which I'll come back to later, have cut the public services shares of budgets pretty much back to the 2015 levels where we started, and therefore reduced the access to services and the impact on inequality. We've seen tax systems becoming less progressive with more reliance on VAT, which is easier to collect in the times that we're in the moment, but it's not a progressive tax, and are once again exacerbating inequality in many of the global South G77 countries. And we've also seen labour rights worsening considerably and minimum wages falling back behind GDP, leading to a rise in wage inequality. So this is why at this particular point it's vital that we redouble our efforts to do more about fighting inequality. In spite of these trends, it's also true to say that a lot of countries have done a huge amount and produced large reductions in inequality over the last 20 or 30 years. There's a list there which I won't go into all the detail of, and then there are many more governments which have been elected on promises to reduce inequality, In some cases, they haven't got very far because they haven't had the money or they've only been recently elected. But in all those countries, there's been a big effort. And there's a big coalition of countries that would like to do more across the world. But it is becoming far more difficult for most countries to reduce inequality. And this is increasingly because of the global barriers to doing that. And for me, the role of the G20 is to get those barriers out of the way, to reduce and eliminate them. So let me explain what I mean. Let me just, first of all, set a context here by showing you that we're now in the worst debt service crisis there's ever been for the Global South. The average amount of budget revenue, percentage of budget revenue being paid out for debt service is 43% across all of the Global South countries. About a third, 34% of spending is going on debt service. And this is going to go on for another 10 years through to 2035 for about 96 countries. You can see in the map all of the worst affected countries, a lot of them in Africa, but a lot are also middle-income countries, and in Asia and in Latin America. So this is the huge change there's been and why it's becoming much more difficult for countries to take their own independent measures to reduce inequality. So let's look at what the G20 needs to do to cut inequality. First of all, they've got to do much more to encourage progressive tax collection. This starts with global tax rules, and I know that Jayati Ghosh is on the panel with us and she knows a great deal more about all of this than I do, so I will keep this very short. But partly it's about really building on last year's G20 coalition of the willing to promote higher taxes on the wealth of individuals, as was mentioned in the opening. That was also reiterated in Sevilla, where a new coalition to do that was formed. And that can be a stock of wealth tax, but it can also be higher capital gains taxes, higher taxes on inheritances and gifts, higher taxes on property, all the different forms of wealth. Secondly, it's absolutely vital that we step up even more the fight against tax dodging by multinationals and ensure that there's a fairer distribution of proceeds to Global South countries. At the moment, there's a system designed by the OECD, which not surprisingly would mean that most of the proceeds, if we did successfully fight tax dodging by multinationals, would go to the OECD countries. That's not fair because most of the things on which they're being taxed, the original raw materials and the labour, come from the Global South, so it needs to be made fair. There are also things, though, that G20 countries could do bilaterally, even if we can't get those global agreements moving forward. One is a lot of them have tax treaties with African countries which stop those countries collecting tax or collecting the amounts of tax they would like to collect by setting lower rates for their investors. And then simply quite often, a lot of countries just demand permanent tax exemptions for their investors. If you heard recently about the peace agreement between Rwanda and DRC, one of the things that has been said in Washington, I haven't got the information to verify it, but has been said in Washington is that what the US insisted on in return for helping with the peace agreement was tax-free investment by its multinationals in DRC's minerals for the foreseeable future. That's got to stop. And then thirdly, there's already a lot of this going on across the world, but there needs to be much more support provided to countries, poorer countries and smaller countries particularly, to help them to collect progressive taxes. There's quite a lot of that going through something called the Addis Tax Initiative, which donors run, but there could also be a lot more South-South work on that front. The second thing is to really get serious about debt cancellation. And there are two different groups of countries here. There's the countries which don't access markets all the time, and most of them need comprehensive debt relief. The Jubilee Commission, which was reporting to the Pope recently, said that we should have what they called a HIPIC 2. I'm not sure I like the idea of calling it a HIPIC because countries would get rather annoyed by being labelled as heavily indebted poor countries. But I agree with the sentiment, which is that we should be slashing the amount of debt service that countries are paying down to about 10% of their budget revenue from the current 43%, like the original heavily indebted poor countries initiative did back in the 2000s and 2010s. And we could really do that if we cancel the debt service over the next 10 years for countries and provided them with a much needed 10-year holiday, and that would give them a huge extra amount of budget space to spend money on fighting inequality. So you can see we've done these calculations from a database that we have called Debt Service Watch, and yet that would provide around 5% of GDP for the lower income countries in the world, which vastly exceeds their spending needs for education, health, and social protection combined, all the key things that reduce inequality. Then secondly, for the countries like, for example, South Africa, which do need to continue to access markets, there need to be comprehensive steps to cut borrowing costs. There's quite a lot going on globally with people saying we'll use public money to bring down the borrowing costs of these countries from the private sector. It's known as credit enhancement. The problem with these so far is they have a very poor record or mixed record in actually bringing costs down and in being cost effective in doing that, not just wasting public sector money. So there's a real need to look at those again, make sure that they do bring costs down a lot. There are lots of global reforms that could help with that, like having public credit rating agencies, much closer regulation of the way in which bonds are issued to make sure that the costs, the interest rates on bonds are much lower. And there's a lot that global south countries could do themselves to improve their own performance in this area. And of course, yesterday, I don't know how many people followed that, but the African expert group commissioned by the South African G20 presidency, chaired by Trevor Manuel, also released a list of suggestions for how to bring down borrowing costs yesterday. And finally, we shouldn't forget this, and in fact its impact would probably be smaller than the debt relief, which would provide around 5% of GDP, the tax measures, which could probably also provide about 5% of GDP, but we need to be sure that we're providing more concessional flows. I haven't used the word aid because I think we should be really talking beyond aid language. It's about shared responsibility and interdependence, and whether from an African point of view you want to call it reparations as well, it's about providing money at the global level to deal with global problems. And for example, there are joining efforts there are efforts going on at the moment to raise global levies. For example, in Sevilla, at the Financing for Development Conference, there was an announcement about premium airline tickets levy, which countries could join. There will be soon announcements on shipping taxes, probably enhancement of financial transaction taxes. So all of those processes, countries can join in. We have a global tool called the special drawing right, which the IMF has, which can be issued whenever governments decide that it's a good idea, and can be used to support budgets and help countries clear their debt burdens. That was done the last time in 2021, but it could easily be done again. And we could also make sure that the IMF is sitting on massive gold reserves, which have never been worth more because the price of gold is so high. And they could definitely sell some of those in order to increase concessional lending funds available. But I don't think we should also let the global north or the OECD countries get away with their appalling recent behavior in cutting ODA, especially for crucial life-saving programs such as HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and food programs. And those really do need to be reversed. It's going to be a long, hard struggle, given that they're all focusing on increasing their defense spending at the moment, but it needs to be a battle that needs to be fought. And at the same time, we shouldn't forget that actually the South-South flows between Brazil, China, India, and so on, are, as a result of South-South cooperation, have not been falling. They've been, if anything, rising and continuing to rise over the last few years, and should be increasing in the future. So there's a lot that the G20 can do collectively and bilaterally to help countries to reduce inequality. We're going to hear in the next session what the countries could be doing for themselves above all. Thank you very much.
Hello? So I think we can do a lot more. Thanks, Matthew, for that. Really touching. I noted a couple of things, I'm not sure about you, that we have growing debt. At the same time, poverty is also on the rise, and that there have been cuts in public services, even along the way. that labor rights are also falling, whilst at the same time there is huge appetite for people who are ready to act, really to deal with the crisis of inequality. Therefore, we must have, amongst other things, pushing for taxation of multinationals, addressing the questions of tax exemptions, and that debt cancellation must be front and center as well, even as we push for concessional flows. Just my quick, takeaway on what has been shared. If you're joining online, at the moment we're discussing today, this very moment, Africa's rising inequality crisis. What role should G20 play to turn the tide? Before we move to the next session, I want to just acknowledge the board chair of Oxfam South Africa, Ms. Pelisa Nkomo, who has been able to join us. You're welcome to the session. I think at this point, you ready? All right, so at this point, what we would do is to now take us through the findings that we had from the report that was produced. I think that would help us really to come to terms with the new evidence that we talked about at the beginning in relation to inequality across Africa, and then also some of the ways we are thinking around addressing these issues. To be able to help us do that, I'd like to invite my colleague, Kwesi Obeng, who is our lead for accountable governance. He would walk us through the findings for that report. If you are ready, Kwesi, kindly, and also with a round of applause from colleague. Yeah.
Thanks. All right, thanks very much. Good to see everyone here. Many of you have traveled far from this big country, so thank you very much. And also for those who are online. Right, so I think I have barely 30 minutes, I think, to finish this. So, I think thanks to Matthew, he's laid the groundwork. Essentially, we can close this meeting, but just we can close this meeting because he essentially touched on the core of this. But I will try and our report provides an African lens to the picture that he presented. He sought to present kind of a global picture and dived into some of the global issues and global South issues, but the report drills down further into our context. And just so we can appreciate some of the things he talked about. Sometimes they might sound a bit distant. So anyway, so this report, as Oxfam South Africa interim executive director said, was launched just a week ago. And so this is the first major kind of face-to-face event. But anyway, so the report essentially is Africa's inequality crisis, the rise of the super rich. And if there's anything that people can identify with Oxfam, is the fact that we channeled numbers about the death of inequality and the rise of a tiny minority, emphasis on the minority in terms of their control of wealth. And mind you, wealth means power to make decisions that affect everybody's life. And so that's where it is most important. So can we go to the next slide? So essentially, I would speak to the scale or the scope of inequality crisis and also speak to the commitment in terms of our government's willingness. Remember a point that I think Matthew talked about, that people think inequality is inevitable. It's actually a policy choice. And so I would speak to the commitment of our governments to reduce inequality. And then also, the report provides some ideas about what our governments can do to tackle inequality. Again, Matthew referred to some of the things that G20 can contribute to, but our governments also do have a responsibility. And some of the other actors, so the international financial institutions, for example, do have a responsibility because they are complicit in the current inequality crisis that we're facing today. Not just today, but over the last generation, since the 1980s and 90s, with the structural adjustment days. So, next slide, please. So, fact of the matter is that inequality is really on the rise. At the same time, we've seen the wealth of the wealthiest amongst us, and the richest amongst us, gone up. So that today, the richest 4 men, and no disrespect to our women here, but the wealthiest amongst us tend to be 4 men. When we have more than half of our population really being women, it's just not fair. But anyway, 4 of the richest men control more wealth than half of the region's population. And at the same time, it's interesting because at the same time, we have over half of our continent's population of 1.4 facing different kinds of food insecurity right across the continent, from Senegal all the way to this country. And then also, $1 million or dollar millionaires, they constitute just 0.02. That's about percent. That's just about 14,500 people across the continent. Own nearly a fifth. That's 20% of the wealth of the continent. While the bottom 50% own just 1%. I mean, think about it. 750 million of our population own just 1%. I mean, it's mind-boggling. Anyway, so, and also, to locate this in the earlier presentation by Matthew, he talked about the global south. Our region is second only to Latin America in terms of countries or regions in the world that are unequal. And more than half of the 50 most unequal countries are here on this continent. So we have an interest to make sure that inequality is addressed. But not only that inequality is that bad, but it's actually deepening. In other words, it's accelerating. And instead of being addressed, it's not being addressed, and so it's deepening. And again, Matthew talked about the fact that post-COVID, we've actually seen a withdrawal of some of the progressive policies that were put in place before and during COVID. That's contributing to the acceleration of inequality. And indeed, since 2020, and it's very interesting because also the wealth of the richest amongst us seem to have expanded so rapidly, particularly in the COVID era. You would have thought that that's when we would have bridged the gap. Yet we seem to have gone up exponentially over the last 20 years, the last 5 years. Actually, just one point. Just 22, 23 years ago, we didn't have a billionaire on the continent. We had 0. But today, we have 23. So we've minted 23 billionaires around the continent. So that tells you that something is happening. The groundwork was laid in the structural adjustment days. But today, our governments are even less committed to tackling inequality. But I think it's important for me to lay this marker. We're not anti-wealth. We think that Africa needs to grow wealthy people. Male, female, young, old, across the continent, because it's good. But what we have trouble with is the concentration of wealth in the hands of a tiny few. That's really the challenge. Because often people confront our data and think that we are anti-wealth creation. No, because we think wealth creation is good for our society. But we don't want the concentration in a tiny few. So essentially, that's an important marker that I think I need to emphasize on. And then, of course, also over the past decade, we've seen income inequality having gone up. And Matthew talked about how income inequality, for example, is measured. It's measured largely, it's not very accurate, but by the Gini. And in a Gini below, beyond or between 0.27 to 0.30%, it means that a country is heading towards inequality, or income inequality is actually on a rise. And most of our countries are above 35. In fact, some countries are as close to 45. So what it means is that inequality levels are stuck in those countries, income inequality levels. Next slide, please. Now, this graph you see on the board, I'm not sure you can see the color, but the one heading up into the sky is the blue, and then the red is almost horizontal, and then the green one is heading down. Now, what it simply means is that it's impossible for us to address inequality. The only time it is possible for us to address inequality is when we begin to address two issues. One, if we can edge up our growth, and this is actually coming from World Bank recent study. If we can increase our economic growth by just 2% and reduce our Gini coefficient, what I just talked about, by just 2%, we'll be able to address, and that is the only time we'll be able to address inequality. And remember, over the last 5 years, we've seen a steep rise in the number of impoverished Africans. 55 million were pushed down as a result of COVID. And I refer to the fact that more than half of our continent's population essentially is facing different kinds of food insecurity. In some cases, it's even more acute food insecurity. So essentially reducing inequality by 2%, accompanied by a 2% growth in our economy across the continent, would allow us to reduce inequality. That is the only case. And many of our countries have been growing beyond 2%. But the fact of the matter is that the growth that we know preceded COVID were jobless. That's not the sort of growth we're referring here. We're talking of growth that is led by also job creation. So next slide. But this should indicate to us that there are solutions. It's not as if our governments are powerless and therefore can't do anything about it. Often that is the reason they give us in terms of not being able to address inequality. Next slide, please. Yeah, so again, Matthew talked about our commitment to reduce inequality, which we've been producing for the past several years. African governments, on the average, are the least committed to tackling inequality anywhere in the world. And on the last index, and we published that last year, the 2024 Commitment to Reducing Inequality Index, only 6 countries, in terms of the bottom 30, were non-African. The rest, in other words, 25 of the bottom 30 were African. Includes Africa's biggest population, country in terms of population, Nigeria, Ethiopia, the second most populous country on the continent, and Democratic Republic of Congo. That just signed that spurious arrangement that allows American companies to essentially get away with, tax incentives and tax rebates as part of the security deal with Rwanda and the US government. Next slide, please. So, from the index also, we noticed that all African countries, in fact, I'll speak to this one first. Since 2022, a number of, particularly from West and Central African governments, countries have committed under the IMF World Bank loan agreements to slash their public spending between 2022 and 2026, and they continue to cut. And over the period since 2022, a number of countries have slashed their tax, basically have slashed their public spending. And Matthew talked about the fact that empirical evidence shows that there are certain areas that if government can invest resources, we are able to address inequality. Some of these areas are education, healthcare, social protection, but he also talked about housing and sanitation, water. And so from the index, we've seen that 79% of our countries have basically reversed the progressivity of the tax systems they had. And then also have fallen back on introduction or implementation of progressive labor policies. Indeed, from another data set, which we capture in the report, there are about 47 countries in Africa that have arrangements in terms of loan with the IMF and the World Bank. Of this number, 44% have committed to cut back heavily on public spending. What it simply means is that they are not committed to tackling inequality, because the very solution that would allow you to address inequality is what you are actually committed to slashing, not to tax the rich. And so that's where we are. The fact that our governments have proven less committed to tackling inequality. And part of the influence is the IMF conditionalities and pressure on our governments to slash back in the middle of inflationary and food crisis that we have on the continent. Basically, anyway, so that's the situation, to demonstrate the fact that our governments have shown incrementally that they are less committed to tackling inequality. It's no surprise that you have 25% 25 of the 30 bottom countries in terms of those that are committed coming from our part of the continent. I mean, I'm not quite sure if anybody has a solution why our governments have proven to be so uncommitted to tackling inequality that affects more than 99% of our population. Next slide, please. Yeah, so an important part of the report is the role of taxation. I talked about the fact that many of our governments have slashed public spending. And yet, they've not slashed or at least introduced fairly more progressive policies that would allow them to raise the domestic resources that would allow them to fill the gap. Now, for every dollar that African countries collect from income tax, I mean what we pay on our incomes, and then also on wealth, nearly 3 comes from consumption taxes. And again, Matthew referred to something like that. Come from income, VAT, and some countries is GST. So essentially what this simply means is that the average person who goes to buy a loaf of bread pays tax. I mean, if a rich person, a billionaire, buys even a truckload of bread every day, it's not going to poke a pinhole in his or her pocket. But for an average poor family in Durban, buying a loaf of bread can poke a hole in the person's pocket. And the person is only, in many of our countries, a family is only one malaria infection away from just falling down the cracks. And so the point we're making is that our governments have chosen a demonstration of their lack of commitment to rather focus on taxing the poorest amongst us. What simply means is that the poorest 90% are funding public services, not the rich 1%. And that can't be the solution that Africa offers for. Other countries, other parts of the world may opt for that, but we don't have the basic infrastructure. I suppose the rich don't quite like our gathering here. I've seen them around. I've seen them around. Anyway, And then also taxes on wealth in Africa have fallen nearly a quarter since 2012. What we've seen, payroll taxes and VAT have gone up. Again, what it simply tells you is that who are the ones who are on the payrolls? It's not the wealthy people. They invest in, different instruments. Those who are on payrolls are the ordinary people. And we've seen that those taxes have gone up significantly because the wealthy have the opportunity and can employ PwC, Deloitte to hide their wealth in different instruments and vehicles. And they exploit that. But that is part of what the international financial architecture provides for them to exploit. But for someone who earns 500 or 1,000 rand, it's not even enough to take home by way of transport. Next slide, please. Oh, and by the way, you see that, just go back quickly. You see the pie chart. The red, it might look pink depending on your eyesight, is a contribution of taxes that come from personal income. Essentially from personal income. No. Actually, that's taxes on goods and services. Again, taxes on goods and services includes VATs. And essentially, the taxes on goods and services include food products. So sugar, milk, bread, it includes all of those. Interestingly, wealth taxes, you might see it, wealth taxes, the olive, it's one. It's so insignificant, and yet we have the wealthiest 4 Africans owning more than 50% of the wealth of the continent. So, that just gives you a stark picture of the scale and the depth of inequality. You would think that this is enough to quicken our governments to sit up to address inequality. But as we speak, there's very little commitment. And we will demonstrate to you why we're convinced that our governments, beyond what I've said earlier, that are not committed to tackling inequality. But there are solutions that we're happy to share, and we think that our government can actually address the current crisis. Next slide, please. Oh, and by the way, one last thing I should have talked about. We've seen that our governments have actually stepped back from taxing the wealthiest. It's not just that ordinary people, particularly with respect to taxes on goods and services, have gone up. They've actually withdrawn taxes on the wealthiest. But anyway, so let's carry on. So African countries, on average, reduce income of the richest 1%, the least anywhere in the world through taxes. And again, this was something that Matthew referred to briefly. And African tax systems are nearly 3 times less effective in redistributing wealth. So other regions of the world, they use tax systems to redistribute wealth. So in other places, they invest in transport so that citizens pay less, or cost of transport is lower, and food is also cheaper. For poor people, transport to go to work and food constitute the bulk of their expenditure. But that's for rich people, that is insignificant. Transport and food, it's not something that even reflects in their budget. So that's the case we have in our continent. And if you look around our continent is the least committed. So you see the blue chart. Essentially, it's an indication of the fact that our governments raise so much from the poorest amongst us, as compared to, and it doesn't, the taxes they place on citizens in terms of the wealthiest does not contribute to redistribution of wealth. But as I said, throughout the world, and empirically, it's been shown that when you tax wealth and the wealthiest properly, and you redistribute them, it's not just simply that you put money in people's hands, but if you invest them in critical areas like education so that our children can have equal access to good quality education and healthcare. And then of course, social protection for those that may not be able to take care of themselves. And I think here, it's so important for me to indicate that right across the continent, the informal sector is the dominant employer of citizens. So that in many countries, from Senegal to Kenya, close to 92% of the population essentially fend or find their livelihoods in the informal sector. These are people who have zero pension, who have no safety net. If they cannot go to work today, it means no food for the family. They probably just have to go and beg. Anyway, next slide. And that's why taxing to redistribute wealth is important. And so so this is one of the solutions we present, that taxing the wealthiest 1%, an additional 10% on their income, and just 1 additional percent on their wealth would raise nearly $66 billion annually. And with just using, again, World Bank data, if we did that, we're actually able, and we just decided that we would invest that in healthcare, we are able to build close to 500 modern hospitals in a year across the continent. Now imagine that in 5 years, by 2030, when we end the Sustainable Development Goals, how many hospitals would we have built? Modern hospitals, 2,500. Now, pretty much every community would have a decent hospital, referral hospital that they can refer to. It would have an impact on the quality of life on our continent. Because today, as I indicated, many families across the continent are only just one malaria bout away, particularly to the breadwinner, and the family has no fallback. There's no safety net to take care of them. And so this is what we have. I mean, Africa, in terms of tax to GDP ratio, is the least. So in other words, we collect the least in terms of our economy. So the OECD is about 34%, which is the highest around the world. In many African countries, actually, it's about 13%. One country is about 11% to the tax collection to GDP. But if we actually are able to tax the wealthiest properly, we should be around 19 to 20% thereabout in the next 5 years. That is if our governments demonstrate a commitment to tax wealth. Next slide, please. And as we started off, the wealthiest people on the continent, incidentally, seem to be all men. It's no coincidence. It's part history, but also reinforced by the current leaderships that we've had. I mean, the leaderships we've had that have not really prioritized taxing wealth. That often is in the hands of men. This is a story of a woman in Uganda. It could be a story of somebody in where? I'm trying to remember this town in Essie. No, not Cape Town. Mpumalanga. It could be somebody there. Well, essentially, she sells flour, mixed flour. She pays 44% of her income as tax. And yet, the average multinational company in that country pays less than 10% on tax. So what it means is that that woman who has no safety, who has no social protection, if she goes to the hospital, she's going to have to pay from her pocket, pays nearly half of her income on taxes. I mean, how can that be fair? And mind you, I said multinational companies. And so because also multinational companies are prioritized in our environment, even over domestic small to middle scale or medium scale corporations. And please step up to the next slide. So this is a quote from the African Union. Remember, Matthew referred to just last year, African Union committed African governments to reduce inequality by 15% in the next 10 years. And we're just 5 years to the end of the Sustainable Development Goals. No African country is able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, this is the former ambassador and commissioner of the African Union from neighboring country, Zambia, Albert Muchanga. He said, there is no need to sustain inequality around the world. The super rich must be willing to give a minimum contribution by taxing their wealth. Either swim together or sink together, and if we are to swim together, everybody must sacrifice. And this is the moment for the super rich to contribute. Indeed, from our data again, if the richest 23 people, the 23 billionaires, lost 99% of their wealth today, they still would have more than the average person can imagine to have. So again, that's just to say that inequality is stuck. If they lost 99%, they still wouldn't be poor. They still wouldn't live like an average person, even if you strip them of their networks. Next slide, please. So that is just to indicate that the wealthiest can contribute to redistribution of wealth, particularly investment in public service, good public services like healthcare, education, and social protection. So these are just but a few proposals in terms of the report's recommendations. There was one point I wanted to talk about. So before I come to the recommendations, we've seen that over the last 25 years, poverty levels have actually gone up by 400% across the continent. Now, as I indicated, as a result of COVID from 2020, at least 55 million people sank into extreme poverty. And secondly, more than half of the continent's population face different kinds of food insecurity. Over 100 million Africans face acute food insecurity according to the World Food Program. So this is stuck, and so it's not as if it's a joke. It has a human cost. It has a human face. And so what are some of the recommendations? The first one really has to do with African governments ought to put in place an ambitious inequality reduction strategies. And we think a starting point really is the starting point is the initiative by African Union, which is now encouraging African governments to tackle inequality. Please address or reduce inequality by 15%. We think it's a starting point, but that is not enough. AU needs to come up with templates to help countries to really be able to measure the progress they are making. We don't want to get there 10 years from now only to find out that we're still where if not worst case scenarios. So that's one of the things. And then also our governments need to demonstrate a commitment, but actually developing real ambitious inequality national goals to fix beyond the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 10 that Matthew referred to. So that's one of the ways that we think our governments can reduce inequality, to help us to track the progress we are making and make amends in the course of the 10 years. And then, of course, also introduce policies to reduce labor inequality. One of the, and I think that our brother Hord will speak to some of the, we've seen that not only are wages on a decline, we've seen that minimum wages have not really appreciated across the continent in any way. have not measured up to the cost of living. And so what it therefore means is that the working class are having to basically shoulder the cost of society, because the informal sector also doesn't contribute so much in terms of taxes. And so the point is that we need to improve, our governments need to improve policies that take care of the public services, and then also reduce the burden on workers. But one last thing I think I need to talk to with respect to taxing the rich is that increases on the super rich, as I indicated, even if they lost all their wealth, 99% of them will still not be poor. But we don't want them to lose all their wealth. We think that our governments need to prioritize taxation of wealth and the wealthiest. And I just give you one example. One of them is from here. From our data, in a country like Morocco, the taxation of property, I mean, we know that those who own property tend to be the 1%, the wealthiest, the elite, both in business and their cronies in governance, right, in government. In Morocco, the country raises close to 1.5 of its GDP, a gross domestic product, from taxation of properties, which is a taxation of wealth and a tax on the wealthiest. In South Africa is doing reasonably well in that respect. South Africa raises close to 1.2% of its GDP from taxation of properties. Now, from our calculations, if all African countries matched Morocco's 1.5% of GDP, we're able to raise enough resources to address the stark inequality that we see today. So it's not as if there aren't solutions. And I just give you one additional example. Kenya in 2015 introduced capital gains tax. So capital gains tax essentially if for example, you bought shares at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and I'm transferring to you, and I make a profit, or I own a company and I sell it to another person, the profits I make, or have shares in it, it's taxed appropriately. Now, the country in 2015 introduced capital gains tax of 5%. The richest amongst that society kicked against that. But in 2015, they reintroduced it at 15%, from 5 to 15%. And check the records. According to the Kenyan Revenue Authority, they've seen a significant increase in tax revenues from the wealthiest Kenyans. So the point I'm trying to make, I have other examples from the city of Freetown, that's Sierra Leone's capital, where they basically reevaluated property taxation, and the city authorities have been able to raise 5 times the revenue from property taxes to address some of the gaps in fixing the city. So the point we're making is that there are ways our governments can actually raise progressively taxes from the wealthiest amongst us, the richest amongst us, to address inequality. One last point I'll make, and I'll put down the mic, is that empirically it's clear that unequal societies are not only unsafe and more violent, but actually inequality beyond a certain point, it's been also confirmed by the IMF and the World Bank, tends to impact negatively or have a depressing effect on poverty reduction, but then also on economic growth. Our governments talk about, we want to grow our economy, we want to grow our economy. The smartest way to grow our economy is to reduce inequality, because inequality beyond a certain level, a certain limit, impacts negatively on economic growth, because unhealthy people can't really put in their very best. And then, of course, also reforms of the international financial system. At the moment, African governments under the aegis of the African Union have pushed for us to have a negotiation at currently what is known as the UN Tax Convention, where African governments are working toward, essentially all countries around the world are working towards a new international financial architecture with respect to taxation. But many of the developed countries are not fully engaged. We want to encourage our government to remain fully engaged in the process, because the architecture, the financial architecture put in place post-1945 is what has gotten us here. It's structured in such a way that it prioritizes the interests and the needs of northern Western companies and Western economies over the interests of global South countries. And the bottom line is that we need citizens to raise their voices, because if we do not have the space as citizens to even gather, it's impossible for our governments to know what we feel about the growing levels of inequality. And so the bottom line is that we need to also, whilst we're thinking about our governments raising taxes on the wealthiest amongst us, we need to push back on the shrinking civic space that is constricting citizens' ability to engage their governments and to engage other actors to ensure that our governments address what is pertinent to the needs of the 99% and not just simply the 1% that we've seen so far. So that's just about a taste of the report. Thank you very much for your attention. Francis was putting a lot of pressure on me.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kwesi, for, I think that's quite a mouthful. And you would agree with me that this is really laced with a lot of information, but just probably to lay out top line, one of the things that I noticed that we are not taxing those who have much as we should, and therefore we should tax them in a way that allows us to be able to allocate those resources into critical social services, like healthcare, like education, and so on. And that is one of the ways we can help really stem this crisis. And our governments must take action beyond rhetoric. I mean, about 20 years ago, we had governments commit, to putting their investments from the budget into, for instance, agriculture, 10%. It would interest you to know that we haven't really achieved that 20 years later. In Abuja, we did a similar thing for healthcare. It would interest you to know that it's just a handful, probably even one country, that achieved that. So that action needs to really be louder than what we commit to. I think Kwesi may have known somebody in Pumalanga. I'm also thinking of who I know well. Maybe Limpopo, I'm not sure. Yeah, but thanks very much for that. I would want to ask that you indulge us a bit. I think at the start of it, we did encounter some technical hitches. And so to be able to help us really transition appropriately, we want to suspend the Q&A for a particular session and then ask that you note your questions. We can discuss that alongside the Q&A for the panel so that we address that side at a go. I hope that is okay. Instead of having a separate Q&A for this, which is what we had intended originally, we would combine that with a Q&A for the panel. So note your questions based on the data that has been presented, and then we can take it from there. Okay. Okay. Amanla. Great. So let me, on this note, invite my colleague Isabel, who is a senior G20 senior advisor, to help us with the panel. With a round of applause, colleagues.
Thanks very much, Francis. Thanks, Kwesi. That was a brilliant presentation, and thanks to all of you. I do have to be very transparent and ask that we have your indulgence to take us up to just on 8 o'clock. There is a bit much longer, but we do have a very exciting panel left. And people have been waiting to be part of the presentation, so hence the request. Francis saw me looking daggers at him throughout the entire evening and was smiling, so I will continue to smile too. The panel that we have now is one of 4 experts who have agreed just to share their wisdom with us. And I think given the basis of the research report, what we're wanting to do, linking the research to the G20 and the ministerial committee meeting of the G20, is to ask, how does this moment pan out for us as activists, as people across the continent, and with links to global initiatives? What can and should we be doing in terms of the fact that we have the G20 presidency here in South Africa? We have 4 speakers. The first is Professor Jayati Ghosh. She is online. I'm just going to go through all 4 of the CVs very quickly, just so that you know who, we can have a flow of conversations. Professor Ghosh is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She taught economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, sorry Jayati, New Delhi for almost 35 years. Her research interests include globalization, international trade and finance, employment patterns, macroeconomic policy, gender issues, and inequality. She has authored over 19 books. I will not read them all out. And her research output has won her a number of global recognitions and awards. She's also the Executive Secretary of the International Development Economics Associates, which is an international network of heterodox development economists, which means that she doesn't think the way that the mainstream thinks, and I think that's really exciting. Matthew Martin is the second speaker on the panel, and we've already had an introduction to him. He's the Director of Development Finance International, which is, and he previously worked at Oxford University, the World Bank, and the Overseas Development Institute. And then we have here, on my extreme right, in South Africa, if anyone says you're sitting to the right, then everyone laughs. So on my right, but not politically, we have Dr. Hod Onyegba, who is a distinguished economist and policy strategist renowned for his work in labor economics, macroeconomics, trade and development. He's the chief economist of iTook Africa and executive director of the Africa Labor Research and Education Institute. So we look forward to having some hard numbers answers to the questions that I'll put to you. And last but not least, to his left, we have Nkateko Chalke, who is the acting executive director of Oxfam South Africa. I think we know and love her dearly. She is a development management specialist with a strong foundation in international relations and human rights advocacy, advocating particularly for the rights of marginalized groups of women, including women and children from previously disadvantaged backgrounds. She's also currently undertaking an MBA at Stellenbosch University Business School, and has a Bachelor of Arts in Politics and International Studies from Rhodes University. So a much more applied degree than law. So without any further information and introduction, I'm going to ask so what I've said to the panelists is will ask them the first question, and they'll be given up to 7 minutes to answer that. And then we'll move on to the other panelists, and then they'll have a second round where they'll have a closing statement. So bear with us, please, and then you'll get to ask questions of them. So first question to Professor Ghosh. There we go. So in November 2024, last year, the G20 committed to international cooperation on taxing high net worth individuals as part of the effort towards purging inequality. South Africa has taken over the leadership of the G20, and in the 11th hour, South Africa also joined the Civil Platform for Action at the recent UN conference in Seville in June, particularly on committing to taxing high net worth individuals. We know that South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, and yet we know that this continues without much attempt to address that. political economics of the issue, do you see any strong headwinds? Do you expect strong headwinds to come from the political leadership of the South African G20 presidency? Or do you anticipate that they'll be supportive of further initiatives to promote taxation of high net worth individuals? Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Isabel. And it's been a fascinating discussion, some really excellent presentations. So it's great that I don't have to elaborate what has already been made so clear by Matthew and by that excellent Oxfam report. You know, one of the things I really like about this Oxfam report, and I think it's important for the international context, is that often when we talk about wealth taxation and when we propose that the extremely wealthy should be taxed, we're told, well, you know, it's not really relevant for countries like Africa because there's such little wealth, there's such few billionaires or millionaires that it really won't make a difference. This report has really blown that out of the water. This has really established that you have such a tiny proportion of people who own more wealth. I mean, 4 people own more than half of the population, and so on and so forth, right? It's ridiculous. But if you could just focus on taxing the extremely wealthy, let's say the top 1%, I think they identified. If you just tax just the top 1%, 10% of their income, I mean, really nothing, right? And 1% of their wealth, which is, again, nothing, you get $66 billion of revenue. And, you know, we all know what Africa has to go through to get the tiniest little droplets of money from the IMF or from any institution, and forget about ODA at this moment. So it's very evident that taxation of the very wealthy and taxation of large multinational corporations that currently get away with paying much less tax than domestic companies is a critical part of what Africa needs to do for its own development. This is very important in the G20 context because, in fact, Brazil was able to put it on the table. Brazil was able to get finance ministers across G20 countries to sign on to a declaration agreeing that taxation of the extremely wealthy is an important item, a policy agenda that needs to be pursued. South Africa must take this forward because not only is it a new situation where the African Union is also now a member of G20, in a way, it's just as well that the US is not attending because the US has tended to try and water down all of these resolutions. But there is an important role that can still be played because we know that many G20 countries, let's say, you know, the rich countries among them, European and other, have tended to push back a little bit, both on the multinational taxation, but also on the taxation of the very wealthy. It is very important to not just keep this on the table, but get more and more countries involved in this. So the Sevilla Platform for Action, which was something that came out of the FFT conference, several of these platforms, but the one on taxing the extremely wealthy. It's very important that South Africa joined, but other African countries need to join as well. And this is a way in which the African Union can actually put this on the AU's agenda. Because if you do something in combination, it is so much easier. We definitely need international cooperation for this. We have to have the automatic exchange of banking information. All countries need to sign up to that. We need to get asset registers because, you know, so many countries are taxing property, that is to say real estate, right? They are not taxing financial assets, which are actually easier to count right now. We should be compiling registers of financial assets, demanding that every country reveal the beneficial owners. Who actually owns all that? Who's the one that's benefiting from a trust? Not the one legally defined as owning, you know, running the trust, but the real beneficiaries of all of these trusts and shadow companies and etc. And share that information across tax jurisdictions so that you can tax your wealthy wherever they choose to keep their money. Colombia showed that you can do it. It's possible. And especially if African countries get together and say, we're going to work on this together and all join the Sevilla Platform for Action on this, you would get a significant move forward, and you would probably shame many other governments into also finding every reason to actually join this, because it's a very hard thing to justify to your own citizens. that you do not want to tax your very wealthy when you see other governments actually doing this. So there are several areas in which both the G20 and the ongoing UN tax negotiation and the other activities that the Group of Africa has played such a positive role in are very important. At the UN tax negotiations now, there are 2 protocols being negotiated in addition to the overall framework convention on taxes. One of them is a protocol on digital service taxes. And it sounds like, okay, something that is not really relevant right now, but it could be extremely relevant because you could use that protocol to develop a system of unitary taxation of multinationals. That is to say, don't allow multinationals to make Apple, South Africa completely different from Apple in Rwanda and Apple in Kenya and Apple in Nigeria. Treat Apple as one global company, and every country takes its share of that that profit as taxable revenue. The share based on sales, employment, users, some formula. Now, that's one very critical area in which, in fact, all African countries and ideally all G20 countries should be very actively engaged in pursuing. The other is the protocol on investor-state dispute settlement, which has also been negotiated. And it was already mentioned by Matthew in his excellent presentation earlier, that this is one of the ways in which, in fact, developing countries are being prevented from collecting their fair share of taxes. And so it's very important to make sure that we have a protocol that actually supersedes a lot of these bilateral investment treaties and all of these other supposed economic partnership agreements and free trade agreements that actually prevent governments from being able to get their due fair share of taxes from multinational corporations in particular. We know that the United States currently under President Trump is aggressively using this as a negotiating tactic. We've seen this, and Matthew mentioned it as well. But in fact, if we can get a protocol that says that this supersedes all of these other agreements, which have frankly really very little legal justification, then that's a huge incentive for many countries to be able to actually go forward with proper taxation of the extremely wealthy and of multinationals. The amount of revenues that Africa is losing through illicit financial flows, and I don't just mean the criminal stuff, I mean the perfectly legal stuff which is enabled by the global system today. And it's enabled not just by the fact that we have a tax system that is broken, that we're trying to fix through that tax convention, but also because there are enablers in the rich countries. There are the lawyers and the accountants and the bankers who are all enabling this. We have to actually go against that process by putting in a framework set of rules that simply does not allow companies and very rich people to avoid taxation perfectly legally when they are the biggest beneficiaries of all the processes that we're witnessing, when the inequality keeps increasing dramatically every year. So it's not just the political economy of corruption that we have to be concerned with.
Thank you very
Final
much.
point, it's the political economy of the laws and the regulations that we have to worry about. That's it. Thanks.
Now I want to unpack that last point, but I think what I really got from your passion was the fact that it's up to each of us here to go to our governments, to go to our finance ministers and make the demands to them. And the fact that the AU is a member of the G20 for the first time means that we have a number of opportunities to engage, and we need to seize that. Thank you very much. We'll come back to you with a follow-up question. But Matthew, I want to come in there, and your keynote address set out a lot of the explanatory sort of landscape, really, of what we're talking about. Now, Africa is facing rising inequality, and we also know that the AU has taken action and set its own target of 15% reduction of inequality under Agenda 2063. Now, part of what you were speaking about is Matthew online, and what Jayati was speaking about as well is looking at raising income. my question to you from the work that you've done is, to what extent do you think that civil society can engage with the kinds of budget allocations made after the taxes have been raised? So progressive fiscal policy includes both raising taxes but also spending progressively. And in terms of the social policy programs that you mentioned, the housing, the healthcare, the social protection, we've seen an increased encouragement by the IMF and World Bank on governments to target. So you only support the poorest of the poor, for instance. Or how would you recommend civil society activists engage to try and ensure a far more progressive allocation of government expenditure in a way that promotes equality in real terms? Thank you.
Thanks. So a slightly different question from the one I was expecting, but yeah, I think it's really vital that that happens. I would say the most important way, there's a lot of experience across Africa in engaging with governments on issues of education and health, both in terms of their overall spending and in terms of making sure that the poor have access to them, that they're not having their incomes and lives ruined by having to pay excessive health charges, excessive education charges, and so on. So I think the real area where a great deal more needs to be done, because this is the area in terms of spending where Africa is falling behind, is in what they call social protection, so social grants at all stages of people's life cycles, from child and maternity grants through to old age grants, and covering unemployment and so on, disability and so on in between. And I think there hasn't been nearly enough engagement on those issues by civil society with governments, or nearly enough really showing what the positive impacts of those social grants are. I have a cousin who lives in Hamburg in southeast South Africa, close to, basically in what used to be the Ciskei. And therefore has a very high level of inequality and a very high level of poverty among black people. And what you see there is in spite of the fact that it's a tiny and ridiculously small amount, the huge difference to people's lives that the social grant has made over the last few years. Now, it should be much more, and it should be much more widely taken up. And therefore, I think that's where the real advocacy needs to come in across the continent, because South Africa's actually got more in terms of social grants than most other neighbouring countries. You've seen Namibia moving forward quite a lot on that recently, but a lot of countries went into COVID with virtually no social protection system, and it's really up to civil society and to all people who care about reducing inequality and poverty to engage with government, because the evidence is that those social grants have the most impact on reducing poverty and reducing inequality, even more so than health and education services.
Thank you very much. Now going back to the question that you were expecting, looking at the inequality, and it is linked very much to the answer that you've just given me now about applied policies to reduce inequality. Are there any other policy advices that you give about how inequality, what should be done and changed to slow the pace of inequality on the continent and the lag in public service investments?
So look, I think it's great that the EU has set a 15% target of reducing inequality. I would say it's probably not enough, and we'll need to carry on for 3 decades to get us down to levels of inequality which aren't undermining growth and which are really reducing poverty substantially. But I think that the key other policy measures, some of them were already covered by the Oxfam report. One above all, I think it's about planning. If we can actually, there's the tools out there now to be able to say, if you take this tax measure, or you take this spending measure, or you take this labor measure, this is likely to have this much effect on reducing inequality. And I don't think most governments know that those tools are there. And if the AU can help governments with assistance from outside where necessary to actually do that planning and to say, here is how we intend to get to the target you've set, that would be great. So that's a really important aspect. And then beyond that, I totally agree with all the stuff that was being said about wealth taxes and income taxes and so on, and not forgetting the other types of wealth taxes. Kwesi mentioned capital gains tax, but we could also talk about inheritance taxes, property taxes. But there's also things about collecting more tax revenues on the taxes you already have. So not just giving away tax exemptions to everybody, if you like, the flip side of what I said about what the G20 could do, but actually insisting on not having tax exemptions, really going after those who are dodging their taxes, really going after renegotiating tax treaties. And then I think on the other, if you like, pillars of the CRI, the thing which comes out very strongly, particularly outside South Africa, in Africa, is the high percentage of workers who have no rights at all, because they're working in what's known as vulnerable or informal employment. So they're either working for their families, or they're working in the fields, or they're working in small businesses that aren't formalized or whatever. And really, the huge challenge is how we turn those into formal jobs which would have labor rights and have the right to minimum wages and the right to social protection as we move forward, because that's going to make the biggest difference. If you look across Africa, the level of wage inequality is so massively high, much higher than in other regions of the world, that when governments come in with tax and spending policies to try to offset that, they can achieve quite a lot. You know, South Africa has reduced its inequality by about a quarter, nearly a third, by doing those sorts of things. Namibia is well on the way to doing the same. But even after that, the level of inequality is still so high that it's still having these terrible negative effects that we've talked about. So it's absolutely vital that we tackle that, what Gordon Brown, our former Prime Minister, used to call pre-distribution, before we get to the actual government budget. And the other things that really need to be tackled are about distribution of land, which South Africa is finally moving forward on, and about distribution of credit and finance to poorer people as well, so that they have access to that type of capital. So I think that there are lots of things that need to be done about the structural side, as well as the things that we look at in the CRI. But I would prioritize social protection. I would prioritize the labor rights aspect, particularly the formalization of enterprises, and I would prioritize the structural things above all.
Thank you very much for both those answers. I mean, in South Africa, we know that despite the high levels of unemployment, that it's the wage inequality that actually is the greater driver of income inequality than unemployment, which is a significant fact. Which takes us on to Dr. Hod from the trade union movement. Given what you've heard about inequality and the statistics as well as the impact on growth, why do you think that workers and labor unions should take interest in the conversation on inequality, which includes economic gender and care work in all its forms in Africa, is the first question. And then an additional question that I'm just throwing in, as you can see I do. Do you think that we need to start looking at macroeconomic reforms in our attempts to tackle inequality? Thanks.
Thank you very much. All these two questions for 7 minutes? We are from the unions, so we want to have some time to talk to our people. All right, thank you so much, and I think a lot already has been said. I was just, making some notes earlier on. Okay, cross this out, cross that out. A lot has been said, a lot has been shared. But I think what we all agree is that we stand today at a very serious crossroads. One that is leading, or we see a continuation of the colonial, neo-colonial structures. And these structures are continuing to give us this gap, this inequality that we see today. And I mean, it's something that we are all concerned about. When I read the report, the Oxfam report, I just came to a conclusion that if you know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that is the first is what? Psychological needs. Then you go to the safety, then you go to the love and belonging, you go to what?
self-esteem, then you go to self-actualization. About 60%, close to 60% of the African population are struggling with step number 1, psychological needs. And with this report, anecdotally, I can say that the 50-60% who are struggling with the psychological needs are the unequal, persons that we are talking about. So think about it. This 1% or 4 people who are, taking the wealth out of the 750 million people are the people who are struggling with Maslow's first step. We have not even moved to step, stage 2 or stage 3. So this is very serious. And for us, if you think about this inequality issue, go to the urban areas in Africa today. You see a lot of street hawking, right? The picture of the cover of the report shows, an urban sprawling city, and then you have the ghetto just right by. So you have the 21st century and the 20th century or the 19th century living side by side. I mean, this is unacceptable, right? And then we also have a rise of the gig economy. For us workers, I mean, we're not saying we don't like technology and we don't, want to see it, but we see a certain kind of, work structure that is not very traditional, with people working long hours. They answer only to algorithms. There is no social protection. There is no pension. There is nothing in there. And that gig economy worker environment is growing, and we are very, very worried. And that, if you think about it, is also deepening the inequality, right? Apart from the informal sector that we always, link this to. And the report rightly so mentions this, regressive taxes, right? This taxes that are taxing the Maslow psychological needs of food, right? Of shelter, of clothing, right? These regressive taxes are pretty flat. And if you look at, the analogy with what is happening with some developed economies or other places of the world, they're in some ways a bit mixed. Sometimes you have some progressive taxes, but for some reason, as Comrade Kwesi mentioned earlier, why would you levy bread for an ordinary worker? We find that very delusional and very disturbing. The gender justice is also very, very stark and troubling, as we heard from the report. So you have the super rich, majority being men, but you have women who don't own lands and do a lot of care work, right? And this care work goes, unappreciated, and that again for us is troubling. We see something that perhaps we did not find in the report, that there is a certain global north collusion with this super rich. Where do they take their monies? Think about it. They are saving and buying and using up all this wealth, exchanging in a financial system controlled by who? The global north, right? This SWIFT system, this banking systems, this, Professor, Jayati mentioned taxing corporate taxes, and the easiest way to actually tax them, in these banking institutions. But what do we see? Nothing is being done. And that is why I agree with the report when it says that there seems to be an apparent regressive approach that our governments are using. They are not, the non-commitment to actually doing something is very, very troubling. It's very troubling indeed. Labor rights, we find also from the workers' perspective, is going down, right? In fact, out of, the report talks about 89% or so that I read in the report. You can say about almost 50% of governments, on the continent, almost 50, are backtracking on labor rights. And the ITUC Global Index, on rights, actually, correlates or also makes similar statements. So we find that workers' rights, collective bargaining, workers' power is being diminished, right? If you have this super rich, if you have these wealthy, individuals who form this cronyism, that is very high to break. This political corruption, political cronyism, and they are in a certain web on their own, and they are protecting each other. How do you break that? You need workers' power. You need collective bargaining. You need workers to come together to be able to speak one voice and demand, a wage bill. And I'll give one, interesting statistic: the minimum wage that we always want, proper minimum wage that workers must earn, workers and their families must earn. Look, Nigeria, you say, is the biggest economy on the continent. Minimum wage in Nigeria is $48 a month. How is that possible? Right? So Nigerians say the minimum wage it cannot take you home. It will take you only to the bus stop, hopefully. Right? Angola is the most expensive place you can find on the continent. You know the minimum wage in Angola? $77, comrades. How can you live in Angola with $77? Ghana is 28. Uganda is 38. Don't let me go on with this statistic, comrade. It is terrible. It is terrible. So we agree with all the proposals that have been made. Workers are suffering. Inflation is high everywhere, right? And that leads to the macroeconomic fundamentals. We must change, right? We have an Africa mining vision. Are we following through with that vision? No, we are not. We're doing something else, right? There is an Africa Continental Free Trade Area agreement that we all want to put together to make Africa great. What has happened to that agreement? We are still with the GTI. We haven't, moved full swing to actually implement this. We're talking about, we just came out from the compromise, the FFD with the compromiso de Sevilla, which is talking about, increasing social protection by some 2%, at least 2% every year. By our estimate, it will take Africa about 60 years to come out of this inequality gap, yet let alone having everybody in that social protection scheme that we want. So the fundamentals are wrong. The macroeconomic fundamentals do not favor us. We need to come together and, have a certain financial architecture that will support Africa, a certain financial architecture that will support the weakest links in our society, as Matthew mentioned, this, social grants. We need financial protection that will favor the most vulnerable people in society. The wealthy have taken so much from us. They are taking so much continually, but workers are the ones who labor every day and do the jobs. So let us strengthen collective bargaining. Let's find a way of championing universal social protection. And care work, we need to make sure care work also comes through so that this inequality gap really closes, because, comrades, it is really, really pathetic.
Comrades, do you see how I am protecting your eating rights here? I come and take the microphone out of his hand. Apologies. Kateko, in the reports that we heard about today, climate change, we see reinforces inequality. I'd like you to unpack this concept of taxing rich polluters and explain to us what it is, how it can be done, and then do you think that mobilizing finance through making rich polluters pay actually would make a difference, a tangible difference to us in our lives and on our continent? Thank you. 7 minutes.
Thank you, colleagues. I'll just take 30. So comrades, what I want to start off with is highlighting that the time that we find ourselves in now is quite critical. The G20 is on African soil for the first time, and in so doing, it's also bringing in the AU, which brings the rest of the continent, which is the country, into the conversation as well. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of the importance of this moment that we're in, because we have a real opportunity of influencing the outcomes, but also setting the pace for deliberations to come as the cycle continues. I also want to recognize, and drawing from my colleagues as well, that the colonial legacy continues. It continues in terms of how the economic structures are shaped. It continues in also how we engage economically, or are forced to engage economically with the system as well. So coming to your question, Isabel, is I want to paint a picture first. South Africa in recent times, right now in July, experienced one of the hardest hitting climate floods that required a consolidated humanitarian response. Now, in the Eastern Cape, this had devastating impacts. 103 people lost their lives, families left in destitution. And so I highlight this because we cannot continue to see climate change outside of our own discourse. Now, why I mention this and why it should matter for South Africa is because that flood itself and the damage to infrastructure and everything is estimated to cost the South African government 5 billion rands. Now that money has to come from somewhere. Has to come from somewhere. We are sitting now with a government that is struggling to even finance its own operations. So you can imagine that we're tempted to look outside. Now, the problem is twofold. The one is that currently in the climate talks, which is through the UNFCCC process, is that, you know, there's a consolidated push by rich countries who continue to be reluctant to provide grant-based financing. 80% climate financing that's coming to us right now is loans. Problem number one. Problem number two is that this whole aspect and deliberations is having rich countries pushing for private finance. So if we are receiving private finance, that means we're taking more loans. That means that we're relying more on the private sector to take action. But this also means that we need to understand that the private sector is always profit-friendly and not for the planet or the people. So who do you think comes first in that dynamic? So where do we stand in terms of trying to figure out where we land, what struggle to take as we look for this, especially for South Africa? We need to look for 5 billion. But in other cases as well, I mean, it's happening the world over. It's not happening only in South Africa. I'm mentioning South Africa so that we also place ourselves in what others are experiencing here in the country, since we see it as a distant thing. As Oxfam, we also work in other countries, I mean, particularly Oxfam South Africa, in Madagascar, in Comoros, where we've been implementing adaptation programs. That is also through finance received from the Adaptation Fund to focus on building high elevated roads, bridges, insulating cities from flooding, and safe havens. It costs money. But now this money comes from a bureaucratic system that makes it impossible for local governments, for communities to access this finance. And what we're pushing for is access to quality, predictable finance, but the bureaucratic system through UN agencies, the Adaptation Fund and others, makes it so difficult for even communities and local government to access it. So where are the solutions? We've heard from Professor Ghosh earlier on, we've heard the statistics coming from the Oxfam Africa Inequality Report. And we've heard that over the past 25 years, Africa has actually accumulated billionaires, you know? We've got rich people here. We keep on saying Africa is the dark place. We have rich people here. Now, these billionaires over 5 years have been able to concentrate and generate at least $66 billion in wealth for themselves. Imagine the possibility of what we can do with that kind of money to finance development every year. Like every year, if we just think about it, Kwesi mentioned it earlier, 1% on 1% tax on wealth and a 10% tax on income per billionaire in a year makes $66 million. That can finance equitable access to health. It can finance proactive humanitarian action that seeks to also fix and address issues and gaps within the infrastructure of humanitarian response in many African countries. Now, while we recognize that we can make $66 billion from the richest 23 people on the continent, we also need to be awake to the fact that 850 million people experience hunger. Now, I don't think we can talk about justice and advocate about climate finance without recognizing that this conversation needs to tap into the transformative aspect of things. That's why we say rich polluters need to pay their fair share. That's why we're saying that while their business and the wealth that is generated by private companies, the greenwashing that we're seeing is essentially translating into more profit and more pollution, more harm to the planet. And they need to be held responsible. And that's why, as Africa and the African Union have really centered the debate on reparations now. It's recognizing that we have to hold polluters accountable. It's recognizing that the money has to come from somewhere. And it's also being true to ourselves by seeing that the money is there. There is money, we just need to find it from the right places. So tax the super rich, yes. And rich polluters must pay because they are the fundamental causes of the problem. And I just want to lastly echo just what my colleagues have said in terms of really for us to be intentional about pushing the frontier on changing, you know, global taxation rules, because this is what reinforces the economic imbalances and injustices that we see. So thank you, colleagues, for that and for enduring me, Isabel. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now, two of the members of the panel have spoken before, so given the short time that we have left, I'm going to ask the two that haven't for final summation points. So turning to Professor Ghosh, looking at the civil platform for action on high net worth individuals, do you think that there is an additional benefit of pushing governments to a greater taxation of wealthy people in that it can strengthen a coalition of the willing in this political time when multilateralism is under attack? Your thoughts in 3 minutes, please. Thank you.
I'm going to try and be even less because, Isabella, I took too long in the first round. Yes, absolutely. You know, let's face it, we know that multilateralism is under huge stress right now. And we know that getting an international agreement with everybody on board is going to be next to impossible. But we do also know that if we can generate coalitions of groups of countries that say they're going to go forward anyway, that creates not only tremendous pressure on other countries and the governments there, but it also enables the members of that coalition to go ahead with something which is very difficult to do otherwise. So whether we're talking about taxation of the wealthy or financial regulation or even coalitions of debtors, it's very, very important now to go for these coalitions And it's critically important in the realm of taxation because as much information as you can exchange about who is holding wealth where, as much of the asset registers that you can create, which let's say the African Union tries to work together to create these asset registers, that becomes a huge advantage for every participating country to actually go ahead and do the tax on the 0.01% of the population that is holding so much of the wealth. It is eminently doable and it is more and more necessary.
And for your discipline. So Had, in the final moments of the panel, Professor Gosh was talking about the African Union, and in terms of the recent Financing for Development conference in Seville, Spain stopped short of a new representative debt management framework. What do you think should be done in this G20 moment to push for a new framework, and does the African Union have a role?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the African Union has a big role in this. It's quite unfortunate the compromiso de Sevilla did not give us much in terms of what we're looking for. We have so much debt. That is not our fault. The African Union actually is trying to come out with a credit rating agency to actually solve that African premium problem, because we pay a lot on interest that we are not supposed to, because we have on the continent a certain kind of premium which is very arbitrary, and so that must change. The African Union in Lomé, Togo, had a declaration as well and came out with very, very cogent strategies on how to solve the debt problem. The Paris Club and the World Bank, the IMF, they have all failed us. In fact, the IMF has come up with a new playbook. You should read the playbook on what it says on how countries can actually work towards default, and what they could get out of it, and that is not doable. And we also know countries like Zambia, how they have suffered to actually have a certain agreement with all these multinational organizations, these banks. So the African Union indeed has a role to play. Domestic resource mobilization is also something we have to be thinking about. Of course, we're talking about taxing high net worth individuals, but how will that wealth be redistributed, right? Are we tracking as civil society, as trade unions, where our money is being spent? We need to follow that money. So we have to organize. We need to have that solidarity. Yes, we need to lobby. I like the education and the research that is ongoing. There's much more. I mean, on the flight here, I was looking at the figures in the report. If Nigeria could just use this recommendation from the report, it will get about maybe 11 billion, and 11 billion can build over 200,000 hospitals and over 1,000 schools, right? DRC could get about 1.5 billion, and that could translate into some 66,000 hospitals and some 800 schools, and the list goes on like that. The African Union has a role to play. Governments themselves at the national levels have a role to play. I will end by re-echoing what Sankara said. No more food for the rich man's cow while our children starve. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the panelists, and I'm sorry about the austerity in terms of time allocation. I hope that this was helpful and useful, and I think that it definitely gives an applied approach to the inequality report. My final saying is just to say, remember always, universal basic income is the answer to every question. But I think I might be coming in on a slightly ill-disciplined note there. But thank you very much to the panelists, and over to you, Francis. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think they deserve a much bigger clap. Even as we race against time, and as I promised,
that we would combine the questions this moment. So just want to open the floor for any questions, including those who are on there. I've already seen one here. Those who are online, my colleagues will keep tabs on that so we know who's put up their hand, and then we can take a round of, I'll suggest we take a round of 5, and then we see additional if there are any questions, and if there's time, we can take other. So I have you raise your hand there. Sorry? Yeah. I just want to note the people. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? I will take that, and then we can take another round. Please be very straightforward with your question. I know that we are activists. We love to talk and kind of, provide some context, but just go straight to your question, please.
Thanks, Chair. My name is Mazubuko Jaha. I served with Matthew in Oxfam, South Africa's first board. I think what the inputs have, and the report itself have underlined is the systemic and structural aspects that generate inequality. And I think that's important for us to acknowledge. I cannot reach any other conclusion but that actually what the report underlines is a generalized and ongoing crisis of the capitalist economic system. But then, that's one thing to say. What then do we do? And then the answer to what we do is blocked, in my view, by the crisis of politics. The labor movement is weak. Political parties have basically opted to stay with neoliberal policies, and popular movements have a weak understanding of the economic system and what generates inequality, whilst they grapple with inequality. So for me, I think that there's an issue for us there. How do we build power that addresses this crisis of politics? And how do we impose popular power on the state? For me, I think that's a challenge facing us. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much to our panelists and all the for very thought-provocative presentations. It's unfortunate that we are running out of time, but I think we're already super saturated, but very important conversation. So for me, I'll just pick up from what I think from Kateko's provocative remarks and try and tie them to the other earlier speakers, because I've forgotten some of the issues, but very important. So for me, I think the question why we are here is, what role should G20 play to turn the tide? It's very important to have the point of departure from an African perspective, which we all understand. But most importantly, for me, I think the issue of reparations and concessional loans, I think the nomenclature aspect of it, because I was struck by Matthew's proposition around concessional loans. Do we really understand what these are and what they mean in the context of Africa versus reparations? So for me, reparations, we can have, Gateko, we can have as much, we can talk as much as possible around reparations, but they might remain a rhetoric simply because the ways in which the global architect, finances are actually perhaps structured are always tilted, but obviously to protect the private interests, private property, and the wealth. I'm sorry, Kwesi, I would really say, I would never say we are not anti-wealth. I'm not so sure, based on the nomenclature, whether anti-wealth and anti-capitalism are synonymous. You know why I'm very worried about this issue of the nomenclature aspect of it? Because as we are seated here, I'm thinking of how do we cascade this report so that it has meaning on the current conversations, on the ground, and on the work that the communities are doing on the ground, in as much as feeding into the G20 process hosted by South Africa. So for me, I guess it's unfortunate, Oxfam team, I think we needed a full day because there's quite a lot on the table that we really need to talk about. Most importantly, why I'm a bit worried about the issue of reparations. Reparations without institutionalization of the aspect of it, I think it becomes very problematic. It's just as good as how SDGs have been rendered voluntary in such a way that these inequalities, we can't talk about inequality without mentioning the so-called ambitions of the 17 SDGs, which is problematic to me. SDG number 1, all those up to 17 inequality. What is it that we have done to hold power to promise? Why is it that we don't have institutionalized peer review mechanisms in place? Yes, we do have the Pan-African peer review mechanism. To what extent is it working for Africa and the people on the ground, the ordinary communities? So for me, I think the question, the broader question around do macroeconomic policies work? Do they have the propensity to change, or contribute towards, eradicating inequality? I don't think that would work unless we institutionalize, much like debt is institutionalized. There are penalties that, through the World Bank. If you fail to produce to service your debt, what happens? And why is it not happening when it comes to any other aspects? Sorry, I know I'm running out of time, but these are some of the provocations I think that we need to really take, because I'm very much interested in Gatego's presentation, because part of what we are working on through the Oxfam South African partners is the aspect of demanding for reparations. But these reparations, what exactly are we saying? How do they have any meaning to anyone, countries, the communities? So we need to have a strong, perhaps, point around that as we leave, perhaps, key takeaways. I'm not so sure. But thank you so much for very thought-provocative questions, but contributions. The MNS issue, I think, raised by Jayat, it really makes sense because I think the issue of multinational companies getting away with it, especially in light of critical minerals. If we don't open up our eyes, we're going to repeat the same thing. So my key question on the ground, I know all these were general comments. Does the fact that Africa is endowed with critical minerals, are we gonna have any change of the narrative? Do you think critical minerals will change the narrative in terms of inequalities unless we really hold our leaders to promise and to account, because we can't run away from it. The politics, the personal is political, I guess. Thank you. Sorry for taking long.
All right. Thank you so much. I'll try to be short. I mean, to be curious when people are hungry is a problem, right? But I want to say thanks to the Oxfam team for the report and the general discussions that took place. I have two questions. One is related to the tax issue, and the other is related to like some conversations within the report that speak on property taxes, right? On the tax issue, I think that I want to ask a strategic question on whether or not, as Global South countries, we really want to use the G20 as a platform to advocate for tax reform. Particularly when you look at the fact that, so it's nice and encouraging that the G20 is in South Africa, but when you look at the fact that the West benefits from the current tax regime, and the fact that like G20 countries generally make commitments that are not followed through, and they spend most of the time like basically evaluating the commitments that they've made without necessarily seeing any kind of action. Do we not want to invest our energy in trying to have greater coordination around the negotiations within the UN Tax Convention, right? That's just one thought. And as it relates to, like, particularly in the report, when you speak around property taxes as a way to tax the rich, should we not always contextualize it to local realities? I think of South Africa, and I look at the fact that over time, the South African government has formalized the ghettos. They've created an environment where people who live in four-roomed houses in townships have title deeds. And the essential consequence of it is that the poor also get taxed on property. And municipalities take property rates and taxes every single month and they measure it with like municipal services, of course. But poor people also pay tax, and how do we try and navigate through that? Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Maybe I'll just, this is open. There are no specific targeted questions to the panelists, but I would ask that we move in this order. The first point, comment on political power. I think, Kwesi, you want to take that? Right? Yep. And then I would also ask that there are a couple of others on property taxation, and they need to coordinate in respect of engaging around these issues within the G20. Any of the panelists could take that. Then the point that you made about reparations, I think that is well taken. But I think the big question is around how would that relate really to communities? How would communities connect with this question or conversation on reparative justice, even as relates as well to concessional loans? That is also something I think any of the panelists could take. There is a question about how, and this is from online, how do we hold our governments to account, in respect of the debt situation? That's also something I would say anyone amongst the team could take, either Hord, Martin, Dr. Ghosh. Any of the panelists could actually respond to that. Yep. So over to you, question on the first point on political power.
Thanks very much. I think in the report and also in our presentation, I think Matthew also referred to it. So over the years, our analysis of inequality crisis on a continent, we've come to the conclusion that it's not preordained. It's a deliberate public policy choice. So it's really a question about the capture of power on a continent. by a tiny elite in governance and in business. And that's why at the bottom of our recommendation, we did talk about the role of citizens. I remember just 10 years ago at the Addis Ababa FFD, when we were just getting ready for the launch of the Mbeki panel report on IFFs, President Mbeki made a statement. He said, and I was struck he made that statement because he said, the only voice African governments listen to is when the citizens rise up. So I think we as citizens do have a critical role to play to shift the balance of power. At the moment, it's tilted so far in favor of those holding political and business power. And the fact is, as we indicated, in a highly unequal societies, there's a threat to not just simply people in poverty, but actually economic growth. And that is what that's the bottom line. And so I think that the report is quite clear about what we could do. So and then also the role that governments have played in the current crisis and what citizens like us, and that's why I think we're here, to see how we can actually push back. Because there is no way our governments would move to address our priorities if citizens do not come along with us. And just to recite one key data that we refer to in the report. So Afrobarometer, as you all know, is a very key research project on the continent. Afrobarometer is a group that basically tests or measures the perception of Africans on governance, on the economy. Last year, in fact, they published a report this year on African citizens' perception of the commitment of their governments to tackling inequality. Oh, no, it was rather about whether they think the wealthiest should be taxed. Close to 80% of Africans said yes. Less than 15% thought it was not. Same with inequality. Close to 80% felt that our governments were doing so little to tackle inequality, and just barely 10% thought their governments were doing well. So citizens are increasingly aware that their governments have failed to address, and so they're interested in just the power and not how the power can be used to address their interests. So I think it's really, this offers us an opportunity to get back to our citizens, our colleagues, our communities, and empower them with the data that is coming out and mobilize them. Because as President Mbeki said, the only voice that African government listen to is not even a threat from Washington. It is when the citizens rise. That's when they will begin to act in our favor. If another voice from a metropole in the north, they will respond to that voice, not the voice of us. So we do need to challenge power, and that's why we also collaborate with labor, because we think that labor is a critical part of the non-state actor space, and they play a key role in terms of being able to have an opportunity to sit at the table with government and businesses. And so they are in spaces that ordinary citizens like us don't have an opportunity to. And that's why I think labor has taken up this challenge seriously, because, yeah, I mean, essentially, I think. The last point, if you don't mind, I wanted to connect to your point around property taxation. So we are absolutely clean-eyed or clear-eyed about that. And in the report, we cite the example of Sierra Leone, the capital, Freetown. What they did since 2018 has been that they reevaluated properties in the city. Remember, that country is even a post-war country. So they reevaluated and actually reduced the taxes on the bottom 20% of properties, 20 less valuable properties, and raised taxes on the top 20% most valuable properties. Now, as we speak, they've actually raised 5 times, according to the government's own records, more from the top 20%. So what we are suggesting is that, and that's progressivity, because we're actually talking about how we build progressivity in the framework. What you're referring to is a regressive tax property regime that we have across the region, where actually you end up having the poorer homes having to pay far more than the wealthy. I mean, if everybody is paying 25%, or let's say flat rate, or let's say even 2.5% worth of their property. I mean, the poor 2.5 means a lot more in terms of the cost to the poor, two-bedroom, as compared to a mansion that probably costs millions of rands. So we're actually encouraging a certain type of progressivity and not the long-standing regressive tax policies that our governments have failed to reform, essentially.
Thanks. I don't know, how did you want to respond? Yeah, to there's a question on. Yep. Sorry.
Okay, I think, Comrade Kwesi, you have that in the report where it says out of every revenue generated, about 2 or more times is collected through VAT. So in other words, the government generates 1 rand, and then it goes around the corner, comes back and takes 3 rand from you. So it's taking more from you than it's generating, and it means it's not generating enough to actually. That's why we have deficits. But my sister talked about reparations, and I thought that was very important. There is an African conference on debts happening in Accra this year, organized by Afrodad and partners. ITC Africa is a co-convener. There is only one clear case in the world where reparations actually help to develop an economy, and that is Israel. In 1952, in the Luxembourg Agreement, Germany agreed to pay 3 billion Dutch marks. In today's currency, that would be $7 billion. And Israel used that very well. They used that to fuel their railway system. They built a lot of roads. There was a lot of subsidies on energy. So they did a lot with that money, right? And so that is one clear case of pure reparations. What I see us talking about now is, for example, why don't we have debt cancellation as part of a partial reparation, right? That is something we want to talk about. And other forms of reparations, if you like. Because if we're able to break that debt cycle, remember, debt is another form of colonization. They have us, how can, French West Africa have their central bank in France? A central bank that dispenses the treasury that holds the CFA is done from France. So what can the rest of those countries do in terms of development, right? And so the debt overhang is so high. We want to talk about reparations so that it is an economic justice, from economic justice position, there is there is meaning in that. And labor has been at the crossroads here again. Workers have had to bear the brunt of these high cost of living and high interest rates and social protection cover not present, and it's problematic. It's problematic everywhere, and that needs to go away. If we're able to break that debt cycle, we can now begin to talk about living wages, because the ILO governing body has now accepted a definition for living wage, which hasn't happened for many years. And so we're actually trying to move from minimum wage to a living wage, right? A decent wage, a wage that families can actually live on and prosper, right? And if we want to do that, we need to make sure first this unequal society ends. We have living wages. People have, look at the unemployment rates everywhere on the continent. I won't come to the rate here in South Africa, is staggering, right? And it's everywhere. So how do we get young people who form the majority of the African population to actually work, right? They don't want charity. They want to work, right? They are able bodies who want to work, and so yes, we want those reparations. There's colonial havoc that has happened to us. It is what must be done. It is what is right. This has happened before. Germany did it to Israel. Why not us? With all the transatlantic slave trade that happened, nothing has been paid, right? And so we need to get those reparations. We will work on them. We'll continue to work on them. But the debt bondage is too much, and the collusion between the West and the super wealthy is also too much. This cronyism, this nepotism must stop. Look at what Trump is doing with a certain country in Africa, right? Where he's encouraging people to come because there is some form of, this is sickening, comrades.
Yeah, thanks. I think I would want to ask that we make progress. I know there are a lot of questions, so that we don't take too much time of some of our friends who would need to leave. But before I pass it to Dr. Lateef to give us the closing remarks, I just wanted to respond to the point that was raised about the potential of, for instance, the critical minerals to take us to where we ought to be. And I think the conversations lay out really how the pathway should look like. How the pathway should look like in respect of, one, the tax models and systems that are in place as of now, how they should shift, and giving the realization of how the current minerals that we have, invested in for years are not really helping us to get to where we ought to get to, then this is kind of a perfect moment for us to reflect these kinds of proposals from a tax regime perspective into this new phase of critical minerals. And I think that would be a simple way to respond to that. There's a lot we can talk about it, from DRC to Ghana to South Africa. Of course, this is a mining hub, so I do understand. But in the interest of time, and if you'd allow me, I would like to call on Dr. Laila Lateef to kindly give us the closing remarks, so we don't stand between. I'd come to you, but let's hear from her, and then I promise to get back to you. Yeah. Laila, if you are ready, kindly come in.
Well, thank you very much.
Yep.
Hello, everyone. I promise I'll not keep you long. I do have the pleasure of making the concluding remarks. And I think from all the discussions that we've had, starting with Matthew's keynote to Kwesi's presentation and then the fantastic panel's insights, I only have three things to say, okay? So first, I think the numbers in the Oxfam report and the discussions we have heard expose the lie, right? What do I mean by this is that we've heard that when 4 people have more wealth than 750 million Africans, while governments pay more to creditors than to citizens' basic needs, this isn't economics, it's extraction. And African tax systems collecting 3 times more from the poor than the rich. From what Kwesi was explaining, it actually proves the system is rigged by design, not really accident. The second point, by way of conclusion, from what I've heard from the discussions, is that the solution is simple mathematics. Taxing Africa's richest 1%, just slightly more, would generate what I heard, 66 billion annually, $66 billion, right? That's enough for universal education and electricity. I think it's also enough to be able to have, secure, functional internet penetration across all the rural areas on the continent. So the money does exist. The technology to track it exists, and it exists through automatic exchange of information and also asset registries. The only thing missing is coordinated political action. And that's my third concluding and final point, that the moment is now. So Brazil already achieved G20 consensus on taxing the super rich. South Africa's presidency can deliver on this implementation. And the beautiful thing is that we have the UN Tax Convention, which is happening on the sides. It's going to create the binding rules, not the voluntary guidelines that people have been talking about. So for the first time in history, we have the legal framework. We're going to have it. We're going to have the technical capacity as well as the political momentum to end the era where wealth buys immunity from taxation. So finally, the choice that is facing us, having read the Oxfam report and listened to all the panelists and the discussions we've been hearing, the choice is whether we continue enabling fiscal colonialism that starves public services to enrich creditors, or whether we implement progressive taxation that serves citizens over capital. I think the data presented is fantastic. It's so clear. The tools happen to be ready, but the time actually is now. So those are the only three comments that I wanted to make so that I'd not keep us also, seated for long. Thank you very much, Francis.
Okay, thank you. A round of applause to him. And, I always say that there are certain people when they're in the room, you just listen more and you talk less. And that was the sense I gathered with the awesome, suggestions, ideas, the genius minds, enormous brains that I would say were literally spilled in the room the past few minutes, if I'll put it that way. And I'm truly excited about that. Thanks to you all for the time, and I don't know, I'm lost for words, really awesome suggestions. The key thing to do is for us to take note of all of these priorities and then see how we can connect that to our advocacy, to our influencing, most particularly in respect of this current G20 momentum that we have. And the report is just a starting point. And we should be able to build that critical mass, of coordination, of, solidarity, as it were, to take it forward. Now, I haven't forgotten you. I still want to give you that opportunity to make the point that you wanted to make. And then right after that, we're happy to draw the curtains on this session. Is that okay? Yes, quick one. Yep, sorry.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. This is just going to take 30 seconds. I am Princess Lorna from the Royal Houses, representing common communities. And the Oxfam report, it shows that Africa, the continent, is bleeding. A wise man once said, those who have ideas don't have power, and those who have power have no idea. I think we need to be angry enough. We are not angry enough. This forum needs to stand up to engage with those that are leading the communities on the ground. And I volunteer myself to say, I am here, use me, to get to the communities on the ground so that we can be angry enough. I thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, Your Royal Highness. This is a perfect way to really close, and feeds into what we're talking about, solidarity, and people who are ready and willing to help us advance from one notch to the other, as relates to this subject matter. And We truly appreciate this offer, and we will be in touch. I know the team has been closely engaging with you to use the authority that you wield to make sure that we're able to get to where we want to head. On that note, I'd like to thank you for allowing me to drive you to this point. We did have some hitches, some bumpy roads along the line, but I must say that we were able to get to this point. So thank you all, everyone who has made time to connect with us online and even staying up a bit late, and also for the rest of us here. And I'll say we can call it a night. God bless all. Thanks.
Recording stopped.